Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in to another episode with me, William Wallace for America, and thank you so much for taking the time to watch. I have a video today that you will not be disappointed with because I've got somebody on who's really smart, knows the law, has been studying what's going on with the governor's mandate or his mandates and his executive order for the COVID-19 pandemic situation. I'm not going to do it any justice. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah in just a second, but she's an attorney with the Pelican Institute. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Well, you wrote an article about the governor's mandate, about the governor's proclamation. I'll let you tell more about it.
Sure.
And I'd love to find out about it and how it came to be.
Well, the paper is an exploration of the emergency powers or of the governor's emergency actions in light of the COVID-19 state of emergency. The way it came to be is we had a lot of the same questions as everybody else has.
Yeah.
I work with a lot of really smart people at Pelican, and I'm also part of a larger network of attorneys who do work similar to what I do. And none of us have ever experienced anything like this. We're all familiar with constitutional law, but this is nothing that we've ever looked into before. So we had the same questions as everyone else. Can they do this? How can they do this? So we decided just to take a look into the constitutional authority for the executive order, what are Louisiana's emergency powers, and how can we better protect going forward our fundamental rights and liberties.
So you've had to not only look at the Constitution of the United States of America,
right.
You've had to look at the Constitution for Louisiana and also the laws and regulations that are in place, that how they work together, and if the governor if he is exceeding his limits against the United States Constitution or the Louisiana Constitution.
That's correct. Under the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the governor and the governors of all the states have very broad authority to protect the public health, safety, welfare, and morals of their citizens.
Morals, you hear that, guys?
So, under the 10th Amendment...
Is that why he's closing all the bars down?
I guess so.
Okay.
Bars and strip clubs, right?
Right.
So, under the 10th Amendment, the governor has very broad authority to act, to declare an emergency, to take whatever steps that they think are necessary to prevent the spread of this disease.
Right.
And at the start of the pandemic, we have very little to go on because, fortunately, we don't have a whole lot of pandemics.
There's a lot of history, right? Exactly.
Right. There's a very limited history that we have to work from. But
so the Spanish flu, which you're going to talk about in a second, you have some reference to that.
Absolutely. What we have to work with sort of is at the very beginning of an emergency, as we are starting to understand what the threat is to our hospital system, how the disease spreads, how we can slow the spread or stop the spread, who it's affecting, and how we treat it. The governor's authority is going to be at its apex. As we start to learn more and more about the disease, how it's spread, how we can stop it, then we're going to expect the governor's orders to be more narrowly tailored in order to preserve our liberties and to prevent them from overreaching.
Right. So there's a fine line between protecting the public from a health crisis and overreaching their constitutional powers.
Right.
And I want to use that as a segue to talk about a lot of people were really upset that there's a lot of legislators who did not sign the petition to override the governor's what they thought was overreach of powers.
Right.
And so there's a lot of people who didn't sign it, but the ones who didn't sign it that I've talked to have said that they didn't sign it, or one of the reasons they didn't sign it is because they did not want to take the governor's ability away for in case we have a natural disaster. And of course that was before Hurricane Laura hitting Lake Charles.
Right.
But they didn't want to strip his powers in case something happened, and they'd be the bad guys.
Right.
So there's that to talk about.
It's a very weighty decision, and there's a lot to unpack into what goes into making the decision to revoke the executive order. So first of all, the Louisiana Public Health Statute allows the governor to declare a state of emergency for up to 30 days. At the end of the 30 days, the governor can say, all right, I'm going to reauthorize this. And he can keep doing that every 30 days. So the
or 29 and a half days.
Sure. Yeah. So the only thing that can stop him is a majority of either house of the legislature can meet and just by a majority vote revoke that authority. Now, with a declared state of emergency, you do have some conditions that only exist during a state of emergency, and they're to help us. So it's a weighty question. So for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was almost impossible to find hand sanitizer. So we heard a lot about distilleries that shifted gears. Instead of making vodka, they made hand sanitizer. So what the legislature decided to do, in the past 2 terms, over the terms that they were able to meet this past spring, is to pass a law that would limit liability. So if something happened,
right,
and they switched gears and it's not the normal course of their operation, they would be held to a gross negligence standard.
Mm-hmm.
That only exists during a state of emergency. So we have to ask ourselves, do we still need hand sanitizer?
Right.
Or is that need being met?
Can we not find it, or
right.
we still have it? Right.
And there's
the same with the hospitals.
Same with the hospitals, and there's businesses. There was a bill by Thomas Presley, I believe,
mm-hmm.
and that one passed. And under his bill, for some operations you need a state of emergency. For others, you don't. Mm-hmm. Sharon Hewitt had a bill as well, I believe, and it limited liability for businesses or for schools. It limited their liability, except for gross negligence, mm-hmm. for this if you were to contract COVID-19 or die in a school or in a business, except for gross negligence, of course. That
right.
only exists during a state of emergency. But we have to ask ourselves, are the justifications for the state of emergency still there?
Right.
So at the beginning of the pandemic...
Do we still need this?
Do we still need it?
Yeah, exactly.
Do we still need it? So at the beginning of the pandemic, when you couldn't find hand sanitizer, when we were afraid that this was going to overwhelm our healthcare system, mm-hmm. I think the answer was probably, well, we don't know what better safe than sorry.
Right.
Let's get a grip on this. Let's understand what exactly we're dealing with. 6 months later, I don't know that you can still answer yes to those
exactly.
questions. Do we still
now
need
that we
this?
understand it?
Exactly.
Right.
Now that we understand it. Now, to your other question about the ability of the governor to declare another state of emergency in the event of a hurricane.
Okay.
This is something we need to the legislature actually
right.
needs a little bit of work on. So under the public health emergency statutes, the governor, like I said, 30 days, legislature can revoke it, and during that time period, there can be no other declared public health emergency. That set of statutes is clear.
Okay.
What's less clear is under the Emergency Powers Act that allow the governor to act when there's a hurricane, tornado, natural disaster, grizzly bear attack, whatever.
Right.
So under that set of statutes, same thing, 30 days, legislature can revoke, but it's unclear whether or not the governor can declare a public health emergency.
Right. Exactly.
So yeah, it's under the public health emergency, you can also have an emergency for a hurricane.
For bears or
for bears and hurricanes,
right,
whatever.
Right.
But under the hurricane statutes, it's unclear whether or not you could also have a simultaneous public health emergency.
Under this new, we kind of hear that they're working on a different petition. Mm-hmm. Can the legislature write in there, hey, we can add in there that no matter whether it's a hurricane emergency mm-hmm. or a pandemic emergency, that the government can declare another emergency within reason? Can they write that in there?
That is unclear. I'm not certain about that.
Yeah.
But I think that the solution is, if they're going to meet in October, that's definitely
right.
that's an easy fix.
Exactly.
That's an easy fix.
That's what I'm saying. That's not for us to decide. That's for them to decide.
Sure.
So if they have that vision
right.
to say, hey, we can't write another law, we can't have another declared emergency when there's a hurricane, but we can if there's a pandemic.
Sure.
It gives the legislator the opportunity to separate those two or clarify those two for future pandemics or future states of emergencies.
Sure.
Now we talked about mask mandates, right. and we talked about something going on in Shreveport, mm-hmm. and you tell me an interesting story there. You guys really need to hear this one. This is an interesting one.
All right, mask mandates. The question that we get asked is, how is this legal? Can they do this? Can
right.
there be a mask mandate? And Daniel, our CEO, you've met,
yep,
he's been a guest. He likes
awesome.
to say, he's fantastic.
Yeah.
I think he says it perfectly when he says, there is something in Sarah's paper for everyone to hate. And it's true. It's true, because
we're going to post a link to her article in this video in the comments, and you can comment on it too.
Please don't come after me.
Yeah, exactly.
The 10th Amendment, probably fine.
Well, your article, that
mm-hmm.
I'm interrupting your thought.
That's
here,
okay.
I'm sorry, is illegal. It's not an opinion.
No.
That's it's interesting thing about this is if there's something for everybody to hate, it's not you to hate on,
No.
it's whoever wrote the laws.
Right.
You're not even trying to interpret them with an opinion.
I'm just reporting them.
You're just reporting them. You're just the messenger.
I'm just the messenger.
Okay.
So there have been over 500 lawsuits filed across the country related to COVID-19 restrictions and mask mandates. The few that I've seen having to do with the mask mandate don't ask whether or not you can do it. There's one decision from a state court in Florida in the Panhandle where they didn't quite get to the question of the injunction, I believe, but they just said, yeah, this is probably fine. Now in Shreveport, it's probably
Yeah.
fine. 10th Amendment, it's fine. In Shreveport, the mayor had a mask mandate. Several business owners sued the mayor over the mask mandate because the way that it was enforced was if you are a business owner and you don't enforce the mask mandate, the city can come in and turn off your power or your utilities.
It's an overreach of power in itself.
A little bit. It's excessive fines and fees, I suppose.
Right.
So the problem that we see with the mask mandates or the angle that these mask mandates are being attacked on is not whether they can do it, but how can they enforce it? How do they enforce it? So in a lot of places, you're seeing somebody who works for $12 an hour being deputized
Right.
by the government to enforce this.
Exactly.
So it's not whether can they do it, it's how do they enforce it. Now in Shreveport, the judge granted a preliminary injunction. The next day, the state's statewide mask mandate
Right.
came out. So that case was dead.
Exactly.
But if you are granted a preliminary injunction, it means you're likely to be successful for it.
Okay.
Right.
Well, that took away basically overreach of powers, which is a protection of liberty in some way.
In some way.
I guess I guess the right word for that would be was accident.
Yeah.
But it's good that we have people like you who's helping people interpret and understand what's going on to be able to protect our freedoms and liberties
Sure.
on this.
Sure. And we're starting to see, we hope there was a great decision from the Western District of Pennsylvania a few days ago.
So, yeah, this was another case, right?
Yes, we hope that the tide is starting to turn.
So talk about that for a
Sure.
second.
Well, at the beginning of our talk, I mentioned that at the beginning of a pandemic, the government's powers are at their apex. And as we start to understand it, 6 months later,
Right.
you need to have, your restrictions need to be narrowly tailored.
Right.
And there was finally a judge in Pennsylvania, in the Western District of Pennsylvania, so federal court, an appointed judge, who said, enough is enough. This has gone on for far too long. This is completely unprecedented. This lockdown is not what the CDC recommends, and enough is enough. We need to, we understand this. We know how it spreads. We need to take another look at this. We need
Right.
to come up with a better way to allow people and businesses to operate. And as I mentioned at the beginning, 10th Amendment, very,
Right.
very, very, very broad authority. A lot of these cases are going to federal courts and to state courts. And you have to remember, Louisiana elects our judges. Not every state does that.
Right.
Lots of states have appointed judges.
Yeah, I love this piece of information. Listen to this.
So in a lot of places, you're going to an appointed judge who has a reluctance to second guess an elected official like a governor. So you'll see these opinions that say, look, I'm not going to second guess as an appointed judge. I'm not going to second guess the wisdom, the very broad grant of authority and the wisdom of an elected official who has the best of intentions in mind to protect their population.
Because they might be worried about an appointment later, maybe?
Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe. I'm not going to second guess that.
Yeah.
But if you don't even really have to read between the lines. For
Yeah.
example, in the Eastern District of Louisiana, our very own Judge Feldman, if you read his opinion, he did rule on the side of the governor. But at the same time, he said, look, it's just my place
Right.
is to decide whether or not this is constitutional. It's not my place to say whether or not this is good for business.
Ah, that's right.
You
Okay.
don't even have to look between the lines to read that frustration.
So sometimes there's a fine line between the law and an opinion.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and you got to follow and we have a country of laws.
We do. And nobody wanted to be first. But 6 months later, I think this judge in Pennsylvania, who's a recent Trump appointee, decided it's time.
Yeah. So he loosens up the restrictions.
In Pennsylvania, he threw out
Yeah.
the governor's stay-at-home order. and the restrictions on gathering sizes.
Which loosened up the restrictions for us.
Right.
Or for them, rather.
Right.
Now, there was something, there was a company or something, was it, I think you said New Orleans someplace, that we were talking about before? Mm-hmm. That the hand sanitizer story about the, I think we were talking about the mask mandate also.
The mask mandate and the hand sanitizer in New Orleans.
So well, what's about the mayor in New Orleans?
Oh, yeah, okay.
You know, how basically how she has taken, you know, now the governor's raised the phase 3, but at the same time, you know, the mayor in New Orleans is saying, no, I'm not going to do that.
That's something.
So now is she overreaching her powers, or does she have the authority as mayor to do that?
She does have the authority.
Oh, wow.
Again, just the messenger, just the messenger.
Yeah, exactly.
The special case about New Orleans, and I do need to do a little more research to understand this a little bit better,
Right.
is that New Orleans is governed by Home Rule Charter, and New Orleans' Home Rule Charter predates the Louisiana 1975 Constitution.
Yeah. I hear about all the exceptions that New Orleans is exempted on a lot of things because they're not part of that Constitution.
We're a special case.
We're a special
That's right.
case.
Yes.
Does that happen anywhere else in the country?
I'd have to look into that.
Yeah,
I'd have to look into that.
Yeah.
I would imagine.
I wouldn't expect you to know because of all the cities there are in the country.
Right.
If there's anybody else, any other city that has that kind of exemption from the state constitution as New Orleans does in our state.
I'd have to look into that a little bit more. I would imagine New York City, for example,
Yeah.
probably you don't need
Yeah,
you
exactly.
don't need the same restrictions in New York City as you might, you know, in the resort area
Right.
of New York State, where you can social distance all
Right.
you want. You know, you're not all on top of each other.
And I want to emphasize that some of this conversation about we're talking, you know, is for brainstorming purposes too, that we like we're just now doing, so that way people can feel a little bit more empowered to research and understand that there's other things going on, you know, and we'll never be able to give all the answers in a you know, video or a podcast.
No.
But also know that Sarah is on this, as the Pelican Institute is on this, and doing this in ways that they're trying to get this information that we're talking about for people, so that way you'll be informed on this. Is there anything else on that's going on with your article that you want to talk about some more?
We're keeping an eye on things. We've made some suggestions to the legislature. Among them are the recommendation that they clarify those statutes to make sure that you can have a simultaneous public health emergency and an emergency when there's a hurricane.
Right.
We've recommended that the legislature amend the public health emergency statute and require the governor to consult the legislature whenever he wants to extend it beyond that initial grant of 30 days.
I mean, that's a great idea. Well, I want to take that piece of information
Yeah.
for a second. When you think about it,
Sure.
you're encouraging the legislature and the governor to work together.
Absolutely.
So instead of having these broad sweeping powers that you may or may not have, depending on which way it's interpreted, why don't you just consult the legislature
Sure.
and get them on your side before you do, instead
Sure.
of just saying this is the way it's going to be.
And you could say, hey, New Orleans delegation, what's going on in your city? How are things down there? Are your hospitals overwhelmed? You know,
Right.
how are your testing sites going? And you might not have the same needs as you would in Turkey Creek, for example.
Right.
So there, you know, the incidence of spread might be lower. They don't have the same needs. So it would also encourage them to take a closer look at what we call essential and non-essential. One of the issues in this Pennsylvania decision was that a group of governor's staff just sat around and they referred to businesses as either life-sustaining or non-life sustaining. And the distinction was whatever they decided that they wanted for it to be. So for example, a Home Depot could be open,
Right.
but a mom and pop appliance store had to close because they were non-life sustaining, even though they sold the same things. So we need to,
It's interesting.
we need to have more clarity in the executive orders. So it would produce a more thoughtful and better definition of terms and a more thoughtful document that gave businesses more guidance. Because if you remember at the beginning of this, some places were like, am I essential or non-essential?
Right, exactly, yeah.
And we also talk about in the paper, rather than talking about businesses as essential or non-essential, call them safe and unsafe. Can any aspect
That's interesting. That's a good way to look through that.
can any aspect of a business's operations be done safely? So if you take a church, for example, not a business, but they were, you know, one of the groups that was targeted by the gathering number.
Correct, the gathering, correct.
So a church, what they could do is offer more services. Or they could do a temperature check when you come in. Everyone needs to wear a mask. You could have a special seniors mass, or people with immunodeficiencies.
Right, exactly.
You could have
So,
you could have a
exactly.
special time. There are a lot of
Offer masks at the
offer
service.
masks.
Yeah.
Sure, you just need to take a step back, and rather than saying essential versus non-essential, safe and unsafe, look at it a little bit differently, and we wouldn't have the shutdown that we have. We wouldn't
like
have
this.
economic ruin like
So what
we're
I
facing.
like what your article does, and what I'm getting from our conversation, and what I like for people to get when they read the article, is that you're basically saying whether the governor's proclamation was constitutional, not constitutional, but instead of just having an opinion on it, you're going into the law so people can read this and read everything about it and be able to decide for themselves what they feel. But what I like, the result of this is it comes up with some ideas and solutions
Right.
for not only the future, but for how we
For right
carry
now.
on from right now.
Absolutely.
So we can find ways to open up our economy, put people back to work, and not be, living in fear all the time.
And if you take a look at our emergency power statutes, at the bottom, if you're looking at them on the legislative website,
Right.
a lot of them will say revised 2006, revised 2006, revised 2006. That's because the legislature took a look at what happened during Hurricane Katrina.
Correct.
And they said, what could we do better in the future? And so they did that 15 years ago now.
Right.
15 years ago.
Exactly.
So there's an opportunity for us to do that again. And Louisiana's public health statutes are a lot more robust than a lot of other states. A lot of other states just say the public health authority in the state has the authority to declare a public health emergency.
Do it what they please.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. And one nice thing that we have in Louisiana is that we do have an elected governor making that decision. In other places, you have a public health authority who maybe hasn't been confirmed by the Senate,
Right.
who hasn't been voted into office. You have some appointed person making that decision.
So for all the criticisms people have of Louisiana and some things, this is one of the good things that we have. Elected judges and our governor doing not so much our governor doing things, but having other things in place
Right.
that kind of spread that power out a little bit, so there's not one person always dictating. And your article certainly kind of opened some eyes,
Sure.
on that. Any other final words?
Check out the article. It's on our website, pelicaninstitute.org.
Okay.
I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has about the article, as long as they read it first.
Right. Yeah. You hear that? So read the article, then ask
The article,
questions. Right.
I have all the sources collected. I have all the cases. I'm happy to send over that new Pennsylvania case. It was decided a few days ago, so it's not in the paper.
This is all fresh news.
All fresh news, yes.
And so, and basically, you offer not only the fresh news about this, but you also offer the updates. And if people keep in touch with the Pelican, because you're going to post things on the Pelican Institute.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm on top of it.
Awesome. All right, everybody, share this video with other people that might think that the governor has had overreached his powers, so that they can read this article and find their own interpretation. And also share with people about the Pelican Institute, and look out for Sarah Harbison's interview and her article in the future. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.